The Herta was released way back in 3.0 around a year and a half ago, and there's been a lot of doom posting about her as a character in the current meta. With all of the new Star Wars mode that have officially arrived, and another drop on her tier list, this is a video I've wanted to make for a while. I've noticed most people who cover this topic aren't necessarily Herta mains, or in some cases, they don't even own Herta, so I would like to offer my perspective as a Herta player. Unfortunately, most of the clips in this video will be low quality with like 5 FPS because I'm pretty much the only person that consistently plays Herta amongst my friends, so I have to use my own clips, so please just bear with me. Some disclaimer, I'm not really a DC, so not everything I say will be entirely accurate, and this video will mostly be more opinion based. I wouldn't necessarily call myself a Herta main, but I guess since I've been using her to clear every single endgame ever since I got her, I figure I have some things to say. Especially considering I'm an E0 owner. I only want to discuss her E0 here, as E2 Herta can still clear most things just fine, so I won't comment on that. I do want to say the video made by Uniquely is very informative on this topic, and he uses math to back up his points, so I recommend you check it out. In this video, I don't really want to talk about her math, but rather mainly my thoughts and experience on the matter. Before I proceed, let's first take a look at her current meta ranking on the infamous Pride and Tier list, as that's what most people go by. She is currently ranked T1.5 in both Memory of Chaos and Apocalypse Shadow, and T1 in Pure Fiction. I do think the T1.5 rating for Mach and APOC is reasonable as she struggles to keep up with contemporaries. I however still strongly disagree with her T1 placement considering she's one of the few characters who can achieve a 2-cost Pure Fiction clear. From my experience, she's also just much easier and stronger than all the other characters currently ranked in T1, except Zeely. I'm a huge Zeely glazer, and in my opinion she should be T0. Anyways, I don't really want to spend too much time arguing her placement here since that's not really my point in this video. Obviously, this is a huge fall from grace when she was triple T0 on release. Strictly based on this tier list, this makes her the second worst 3.x DPS behind Aglaya, who was also released in the same patch as her. But how did it come to this? Is she truly that much worse? I want to start by talking about my personal experience and my journey with Herta. So Herta was actually my first limited 5-star. I got her back in patch 3.3 when I started the game. I actually started playing a bit during the anniversary in 3.2 when I was still just a Genshin player. I figured I might as well just grab the anniversary rewards. I didn't pull for her because she was meta. I had no idea what Star Rail meta was back then. I pulled for her just because I remember seeing a ton of edits of her. I thought she was super cool and lore important. Newsflash, I did enjoy her in lore a lot because she actually talks normally and gets to the point, so no regrets for her. I also got Hyacinth at the same time because I thought she looked like Barbara from Genshin. Also no regrets there since she was much stronger than I thought. When I first got her, I didn't get her Lightcone, so I just used the free Herta Shep Lightcone, and I didn't pull for Tribute or Anoxa either. Even though my friends told me she was the apex of meta, I didn't quite feel it at the time since I was just a noob. I was more focused on just taking it slow and enjoying the story. My first ever endgame clear was actually back in version 3.6, where I barely managed to 3-star APOC. It was also during that patch that I first got Anoxa and Herta Lightcone. I didn't have Tribute then, so I just used Tingyun. By then, Herta was already rated T0.5 in both Mach and APOC, so in a sense, I never got to experience the true prime of Herta. Also, my friends who played before told me she shattered the damage ceiling back then and drastically defined the meta, but since I wasn't playing then, I don't have a lot of opinions on that. I later got Trippy in patch 3.7 and finally cleared Memory of Chaos for the first time, as well as Pure Fiction. It's important to note that at this point, I haven't been able to score 40k in Pure Fiction due to the quality of my builds and lack of a proper second team. My first ever Pure Fiction clear, I actually split Anoxa and Herta. I remember being extremely frustrated at Herta's performance in Pure Fiction, because she was supposed to be the queen of Pure Fiction, and I was struggling to perform well. Of course, a lot of this stemmed from my skill issue and build issues, as I was still learning how to properly tackle the endgame. Then came 3.8, where Herta was officially dropped from T0 to T0.5, but it was ironically also my first ever 40k Pure Fiction with Herta. At the time, I was still a noob and didn't really dabble in Sustainless, so I wasn't quite familiar with it. I also still used Anoxa in Pure Fiction with her as well. By the way, if you're watching this, do not do that. He is bad for her in Pure Fiction. I know he's rated as T1 as a sub DPS, but honestly he's more like T2. If you're concerned about your score, you should never use him as a sub DPS for her in PF. The drop to T0.5 definitely confused me at the time, since I just got 40k, and the deer had ice weakness. I didn't quite understand the reasoning behind the drop. People were starting to say she was washed, but ironically for me, I was clearing faster and better with her in every single game mode. Possibly because I finally have her full team. Now, as a side note for those wondering why I didn't play DPS Anoxa, that's because I skipped Siren. As I said, I was more of a noob back then and was less concerned about meta. I wasn't particularly impressed by Cyrene's lore and also had very little pulls then. I've heard rumors of rerun of Fugue and I needed to pull Dahlia for my break team. I did have Ceridra, so I could sort of play DPS on Noxa, but probably due to the lack of build quality at the time, my Herta team was still better. In 4.0, Herta officially dropped to T1 in both Mach and APOC. I didn't have much thought about this assessment, I just know I was still clearing faster and better than I ever was before. But the reality was there. My break team was decimating every game mode with Dahlia, and I had to lock in on Herta to do decent. In 4.1, we had the easiest memory of chaos ever, but I also knew it was the calm before the storm. It is to date the only memory of chaos I ever truly zero cycle. I knew I would never had another chance like this, so I put in all the effort to zero cycle in this memory of chaos. I only had S for DDD, so I was worried. Nevertheless, I somehow prevailed and achieved the zero cycle. It is also around this time that I finally looked deeply into the Genius archive. It really fascinated me that people were pushing some quote-unquote out-of-meta DPS into their absolute best. It was because of this website that I was able to achieve my zero cycle on Herta. Around 4.1 was also the last time I used Anoxa with Herta in Pure Fiction. I finally realized Mini Herta was just better. Partially, why I didn't really build Mini Herta was because I had hoped that a better Erudition partner was coming, and I finally realized it wasn't going to happen, so I just maxed out Mini Herta for good there. I remember a bit earlier before 4.0 released, there were rumors on how Silverbolt SP or Blade SP will be Erudition, but obviously none of them were true, so it was a bit disappointing. The same 4.1 patch, I also officially finished all of Amphoria's story and finally unlocked the unfinished epilogue trace for RMC. This was when I finally went sustainless on Herta. I have to admit, it was a bit awkward. I didn't really know how to navigate sustainless back then that well. I tried using sustainless Herta on both Sam and Argenti in Pure Fiction. It was quite enamored by her performance then. I cleared both in 1 or 2 cycles, and a damage jump was such a huge boost that I finally realized the true power of sustainless. Sadly, I wasn't pro enough to zero cycle, so that never happened. I was finally realizing the true potential of my characters and in adjusting my builds to better suit my needs than just blindly slapping random relics onto them. However, in the same 4.1, despite absolutely having a stellar performance in both PF and Mach, I struggled immensely in APOC. It was possibly my lowest scoring APOC to this date, if you don't count 3.6, since I didn't have a full team then. I scored only 3356. I was unable to improve it any further. It was around this time that I finally started to see the cracks being shown. In 4.2, I got Tribu's E1. I didn't activate it though. I wanted to keep using E0 as long as possible, but Temptation got the better of me, and I wanted to zero cycle King, so I activated for my Firefly. Unfortunately, I only had S for DDD, so that blocked me from zero cycling, since I was only one more E2 action away from zero cycling. I knew that with S5, it was definitely impossible. I guess you can call that cope, but it is what it is. However, in 4.2, Dark Sam returned, and this time, I also achieved 4 cycles on Dark Sam, just like last time. The only problem was, this time my builds were much better and optimized, as well as the addition of E1 Tribu, yet I performed just the same. In 4.3, I finally got Cyrene on her rerun and was finally able to properly play main DPS on Noxa. I also picked up more Nax play, but I mainly pulled in for Fei Xiao. This same patch was also the first patch I actually didn't use Herta in an in-game mode. Against Flame Reaver, I scored around 3,300 points again. It was quite disappointing to see. I later tried some optimizing and even went sustainless, but I was only able to bring it up to barely 3,600. For the sake of my sanity, I didn't keep attempting. Herta also officially dropped to T1.5 in both Mach and APOC. Seeing the clears on the archive, I was well aware an E0 owner like me couldn't possibly continue to afford sustainless and Mach and APOC, so it was a bit sad to see. Star Wars mode in Pure Fiction and Mach both arrived soon, and I tested Herta there as well. I continued to dominate Pure Fiction even with sustain. I was still able to 40k, so you can imagine I still disagree with her drop to T1 considering my own performances and seeing the clears on the archive. Around this time, both Rin and Himiko Nova were officially announced, and I got to see their kits. I know a lot of Herta mains were coping, but it was obvious Rin had no synergy and Himiko Nova has a little bit, if there were even any to begin with, so it was just another major disappointment. There was a lack of real showcases on Himiko Nova with Herta, so when 4.4 dropped, I naively pulled for her, thinking maybe I could somehow make it work. I thought I liked Himiko enough to play her as a main DPS as well. So what I'm about to say might sound a bit crazy, but my greatest Star Rail regret is pulling for Himiko Nova. I regret none of my other pulls, not even my Rappa, not even my level 1 Yaoguan. Her playstyle just wasn't that fun to me, and she didn't wow me like Mornax Blade did. It was just another disappointment when 2 Erudition characters released and they all don't work with Herta. A major reason I pulled for Himiko was because of meta, and I was tired of tryharding on all my other teams. I wanted an easy team to play, but she just wasn't as standout as I thought. I later got her S1, and it was strong, but she just didn't strike me as super meta defining. I'll talk more about Himiko Nova later, because I was getting kinda off topic. So in the current in-game at 4.4, I scored 2 cycles on Flame Reaver with Herta. With a sustain, I was able to get above 3,850 points in APOC against the TV monkeys. But obviously these are Herta shield bosses. On the other bosses, the scores were quite disappointing. I scored 8 cycles against Graphia. Against both Argenti and Nicodor in APOC, I barely got 3,300. I do believe there's a sustainless comp that could potentially work against Argenti, but I do not care enough to try it. All my clears are on this channel so you can see how I did with her on all past endgames, but the question remained, how did she quote-unquote fall so far? The answer is actually quite simple once you take a look at the entire 3.x roster. She is the only non-Infurious DPS, and guess who is released in 3.8 as biz for practically all Infurious character? That's right, Cyrene. Now, there are technically 1 or 2 exceptions to this, like Heistland's and maybe E0 Finon, but Heistland's teammates got 2 Nova Flares, and Finon has the luxury of just going sustainless quite easily. So everyone except her got a boost. She received no proper teammates or support, while all the other 3.x characters did. We also need to take a look at her best in slot E0 team, which in Mach and APOC has Anaxa as a sub DPS, but in Pure Fiction, it's just Mini Herta. Do we see the issue here? Mini Herta is a 4-star. The Herta is the only 5-star character who has a 4-star character on her best team, so obviously her performance will tank as a result as well there. Now let's talk about her sub-DPS options, which is a huge problem. Anaxa is a bad sub-DPS by design. We know he was definitely intended for Herta, but all he has is a pathetic damage trace. He can double skill, but other than that, he offers very little. Obviously, later sub-DPSs are better well-designed like Sparksy and Every Night, but don't even bother with the other Erudition characters because none of them actually buff the team or Herta herself. Jade buffs speed, which is useless on Herta. I know people say you can technically buff the speed on your sustain like Linkshot or Tribi, but come on. Is that really a buff to the team? That barely changes anything. Like, what can you do with it? Maybe build a slower down hang with more attack? Now is where I want to talk about Himiko Nova. There were some Herta players that hoped Himiko Nova could sort of work. I can see why. On paper, her Decimation mode offers 100% team-wide crit damage, and another 100% crit damage to skill damage. Himiko Nova also actually does damage unlike Anaxa, and has off-field damage from her assist skills. However, from my experience as an E0 S1 owner of both characters, I must say they stuck together. It was awful trying to make them work. They might work together if either Herta or Himiko Nova are E2, but I'm talking about E0, or perhaps if you have E4 Well, but not everyone has that. I'm not even sure if E4 Well will make it substantially better. This isn't in case of Himiko Nova simply wheelchairing Herta or Herta dragging Himiko Nova down. Himiko Nova is also making Herta worse. Yes, I'm saying Himiko Nova is worse than Anaxa as a sub DPS. For the context, I only have E0 Well. I do not have E2 or E4, which are items that can make a significant difference. I know zero cycling isn't everything, and it's a philosophy I preach, but if I need E2 or E4 Well just to match the performance of an E0 Anaxa, I don't think that's an amazing trade-off at all. Using Sustainless Himiko Herta together only got me 2 cycles against Flame Reaver. As fast as my Sustained Herta clear, obviously it can be optimized to 1 cycle maybe, but then that would just be as fast as my Sustainless Herta Anaxa clear, so you can hardly call that an improvement. Himiko Nova on her own can 0 cycle, so why do I even bother? I see a lot of Herta players posting about how great she is against the TV monkeys, to which, once again, I have to disagree. Using E0S0 Anaxa and E0S1 Herta, I was actually able to score up to 3851. This score can actually be even higher, but my Himiko Nova together with Herta can barely get above 3800, yet when I use Himiko Nova herself, she can easily reach 3884. But why don't they work together? That is mostly because Himiko Nova needs a Trailblaze companion, and you would need Well for Decimation. Well is very awful at charging Herta, and without E2 he also has energy problems. This means she is already worse for Herta at sustained team comps, because you can't use Tribi or Blade, so you're forced to run sustainless. However, other issues still persist. Himiko has energy issues herself and is slow at charging ults, unlike the other Erudition sub DPS. She is also quite awkward to use with the Ego set. I'll say this though, Herta does indeed do more damage when Himiko is on a team with Decimation active, but that isn't enough to offset how slow Himiko is at charging Herta. Furthermore, this team comp absolutely gimps Himiko's damage, so neither of them are realizing their true potential. Sorry, that was a bit of a rant, but if you're a Herta main thinking about using them together, just don't. I did it for science, so you don't have to. Unless you're an E2 player, then go ahead. Some people might argue her buffers are weak, which would be Tribute. In some cases, it would be more Next Blade. Or you can use them both for sustainers. I think they're fine since they perform the job well enough to amp Herta, but as always, a better buffer can always be good for Herta. She is also just not that good in low target scenarios. This was true even on her release. The endgames just happened to have more AoE show back then, and once that was gone, it was harder for her to keep up. Even in 3 target scenarios, she stacks quite slow. The problem I've noticed every time I play her in low target scenarios is how much slower she charges and how hard it is to stack up before it too. And look at the current patch right now. We have AoE show because of Himiko Nova, and suddenly she's performing pretty well. Besides all this, I also want to talk about a less talk about issue, and that's about how bad her FTP Lightcones are. When people talk about investing Herta, or just usually any character in general, it's usually always E2 first if you can, otherwise S1, but I do think for Herta, her Lightcone is just so much better than any other options. The only good 4-star option is the Battle Pass Lightcone. Today is another peaceful day, and this requires you to spend money, which is obviously not ideal. Her only other FTP options are the Herta Shop LC, which doesn't have full uptime on the Zero and Pure Fiction. It gives a speed buff that she doesn't even care about. Both Genius Repose and the Seriousness of Breakfast requires you to actually kill enemies for the effect to maintain uptime, and that's just not realistic unless you're in Pure Fiction. So let's just sum up the main issues here. Poor teammate options, poor performances in low target scenarios, and poor Lightcone options. What can be done to fix this? So ideally, this new Erudition partner should have a lot of quote-unquote hits to charge Herta, and they need to have a fast ult that can charge Herta even faster. Maybe even some frequent off-field damage, like follow-up attacks that can trigger on certain conditions. Besides just all this, they should ideally maybe offer some form buff, such as a team-wide depth shred. For the low target scenarios, I know many Herta players talk about the AoE bond in Currency Wars, which I agree. This new teammate could simulate dummies for Herta, so she doesn't lose as many stacks and can charge much faster for her ult. As for Lightcone options, well, I guess not much can be fixed there. However, after all this, what do I personally think? Do I think Herta is truly bricked and unplayable? I have to disagree. Time and time again, I see a lot of players say that even their E2 Herta is bricked, but my E0 is somehow performing better than their E2. I do think some of the Doom posting has made people think she's genuinely unplayable. When you're playing in-game, you don't just go, yeah, I'm gonna purposely use her against Sam, the boss that she sucks against, because it's just one single huge HP blob without any other targets. No, you're gonna use her against the boss that she performs the best in. That's what you do in the endgame. You're obviously gonna put your teams against the boss to perform well, and you're not gonna actively brick your own teams on purpose. Generally, Herta can still perform well enough to clear. A reminder that you only need 4 cycles in Mach, 33k in Pure Fiction, and 3400 score in APOC to fully clear the endgame, which is quite doable for her. This is also assuming all your other teams take just as long. Personally, I also don't like it when people post about how their Herta is bricked, but they refuse to use Tribi or her actual teams to push their own agenda. You really can't expect teams to perform well when you intentionally make them worse. This applies to most characters. It's like arguing Casters is bad because your Casters doesn't have Hyacinth and doesn't have Siren, so because you refuse to give her teammates. So yeah, if you're using her actual teams, then she should still be able to perform decently fine. Of course, she still has a lot of issues that I hope will be addressed in the future. I know a lot of people compare her to Akron and Firefly on how quote-unquote bad she is, but if you observe class clears, she is still performing better than pre-Dahlia Firefly and pre-Blade Akron. It took 13 patches for Firefly to receive Dahlia, and she was already massively crippled by then. Not to mention Firefly wasn't even that great in Pure Fiction. Akron took even longer to get more Next Blade, so I wouldn't worry too much. I actually think it's better if the fix is later, since it will most likely mean the fix will be even more meta by then. I guess after all this, my conclusion is she needs better teammates that can address her weaknesses so she can continue to perform well. Maybe Steven will finally save us all for real. She is definitely not as dominant as before, and I wouldn't recommend investing in her, but I don't think it's fair to say she's unplayable. As I said before, I don't consider myself a Herta main, but I'll probably continue using her in Pure Fiction because of how good I perform with her there. Hopefully her will regain her crown one day. That's all I really want to say. Thanks for listening to my yap. As always, if you like my crappy content, please be sure to like and subscribe. It means a lot to me.